So I'm very excited to introduce my friend Sebi Medina-Tayac, who's going to be speaking to us today. He's a friend of our families, and he's also a part of the Piscataway Indian Nation. He's an activist, an organizer, and he's also a filmmaker. And he's got a lot of great information and just stories that he's going to share with us tonight. And I'm so looking forward to hearing it. So I'm going to turn it over to Sebi.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for this invitation to speak here to your community or to this circle that's trying to expand their minds and trying to find new ways to look at life. And I hope I hope I'm able to offer a new window, maybe a new glint of light reflecting off of broken glass to understand the world. And first, just to introduce myself as well. My name's Sebi Medina-Tayac. I'm a member of the Piscataway Indian Nation. So I say I'm the member of a Indigenous community because my identity is one that I've lived every day, and it's based on a relationship and membership in a community. I'll speak up a little bit. It's one that's based on membership in a community, which is different than having heritage or genealogy that is Indigenous. And it's important to make that distinction for me for reasons that I'll explain later. There's a lot of people all across the American continent and all across the world that have Indigenous heritage. In fact, we all have Indigenous heritage, even people from Europe and Asia, and if there's anybody who lives in Antarctica, them too, we all have Indigenous heritage because all of our ancestors were Indigenous at one time. The distinction I make is that I'm a member of a living Indigenous community that has an Indigenous society that is still intact. And then another thing I'll introduce myself with is I'm a part of the Beaver Clan, which is one of several clans of our tribe that is a way of explaining who your mother is. Our clans are matrilineal. So if I say I'm part of the Beaver Clan, somebody else who's a member of my community will know who I descend from, what part of the tribe I descend from. They might even know what town or village I'm from. So that's my way of introducing myself from the Native perspective. From the Western perspective, I'll just give a little brief introduction of who I am. Actually, I'm sorry. And one last thing that goes with an Indigenous introduction is an acknowledgement of the elders who are here. So starting, of course, with our Native elders, if there are any Native people who are on this call who are older than me, I would like to acknowledge them and ask for their grace and permission to speak. Our culture is very much guided by our elders and our ancestors. So before a young person opens their mouth to speak, they have to first ask permission from those people to speak. So I start with that acknowledgement, and then I also want to move to my elders on this call who are not Native, to acknowledge that I'm coming to you with humility, as a young person. I'm 24 years old, and I think I've experienced a lot of things in my life, but I know that you all have been on this earth for longer. So I acknowledge your experiences, and I acknowledge your wisdom and knowledge that I might not have. And I've been invited to speak here during this hour and a half, but if anybody has any comments or questions, I would invite them to write them in the chat box. I have that pulled up, and I want this to be as dynamic and participatory as possible. So if anybody has anything they want to say, any questions they want to ask at any time, please just write them in the chat box. somebody asked about people who are calling by phone that might not be able to do the chat box. We're going to leave some time at the very end for people to ask questions in their voice. So if there are people on the phone, just sit tight, and that last 15 minutes, you'll have the opportunity, if you choose, to ask a question or make a comment. Give me 1 second. My water just finished boiling. Sorry about that. I had a long day, and I'm making tea to stay awake. So there's a couple things I wanted to share with you today. I have some notes written out, but it's going to be kind of free flowing. And like I said, I want to also be guided by your feedback and your questions and comments as we go along. To give you, like I said, a little background of my life sort of in the mainstream American society. I grew up in Tacoma Park, Maryland. I saw there was somebody from Tacoma Park. So shout out to Tacoma Park and my DC area people who are here. I went to Montgomery Blair High School, and after that I went to Yale College for my undergrad. And throughout my life, I've grown up in an Indigenous tradition, coming from my family members who are Piscataway. We're the Indigenous people of Maryland. So having grown up in Maryland, I had the privilege of having very close access to my culture and my community. A lot of Native folks are displaced from their land, so they don't have that. But I was fortunate that my family held very closely to their culture, so I grew up that way. After I graduated college, I've pretty much dedicated my life to grassroots activism. I've done a couple stints in the nonprofit world. I worked for the People's Climate March, the Zero Hour Youth Climate March. I did a tour in Standing Rock, and a lot of that is, I would consider, the family business. Grassroots activism is just a way of life that I grew up with that I didn't even, have a name for until I got older. Both of my parents were involved in human rights movement, and particularly in the Indigenous freedom struggle, which goes by many names. Currently, I work at Eaton Workshop, which is sort of a progressive hub and hotel downtown that resources and serves as a platform for grassroots activism in DC. So from the very shoestring church basement, school powwow in the school, rented out school gymnasium, to the organizing meetings and row houses in Mount Pleasant, to like boring nonprofit world, and now to like corporate for-profit world. I've sort of seen activism in its many different forms, but at its most core for me, my freedom is my vision for freedom is very connected to land and place. So I hope to give everybody a better understanding of how Indigenous people think of land, space, place, and also how we think about time. I know you have several more webinars coming up that Annie has curated, and Annie and Adriana, of course, have curated. So, I can't cover everything, nor am I qualified to cover everything, nor can anybody cover everything. But what I can do is walk you through maybe some fundamental ideas and things that might open your mind up and open your heart up to another way of looking at the world. And as I was telling Annie, one way to do that is through stories. Indigenous people, the way we teach and learn is not curricula, or it's not necessarily explaining abstract concepts and retaining them. It's about telling stories, and the meaning and the lessons that come from those stories can change and evolve depending on your life situation. And so let me just jump right into it. Okay, so I told you the name of my tribe. If you remembered it, I'm impressed with you. It's Piscataway. We're the indigenous people of Maryland, on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So everything from around Baltimore area down to St. Mary's City is all our traditional, what we call our ancestral homelands. So that's where we're from, that's where we identify with, and our people currently and presently still live in that area. Piscataway is a word that means the confluence of waters. And every sub-tribe in our, it was like a chief, you could call it a chiefdom, you could call it an empire, you could call it a nation. A nation is sort of the fashionable or current way to translate this concept into English. Our nation was made up of many smaller villages and peoples and groups that had, slightly different dialect, they had a slightly different culture, they had a slightly different way of living. And each one of those groups was named after the waterway that was closest to them. So for those of you who are familiar with the Washington, D.C. metro region, you would know the Anacostia River. Well, the original people of that land, which is now southeast and northeast D.C., and Bladensburg, Maryland, the original people of that land were called Anacostans. So the river was named after the people, and the people were named after the river. There was also Mattawaman, Patuxent, Nanjamoy. Pretty much every river or creek in Maryland is named after one of our sub-tribes or one of our peoples. And there's a reason for that. Piscataway is the unifying concept. So the confluence of waters is how we identified ourselves. But if we view water and people as the same thing, which they are, what Piscataway means really is the confluence of peoples. So like when we think of a contemporary concept like the United States of America, well, back in the day, Piscataway metaphorically meant the united peoples of the water. That's just one way to understand it. And that goes back to our origin story. Our deepest understanding of ourselves is that we come from water. And everybody knows that this is scientifically true, that 70% of our bodies are made up of water. But it goes deeper than that. The water that we drink in DC comes from the Potomac River. So when you go to the Potomac River, you're interacting with a body of water that is the same substance that 70% of your body, Another thing when we say we come from the water is not only that we share a name and identity with the water, and not only that we're physically made of the water, but it also it explains our humanity, because we all come from the original water of our mother's womb. And that process of childbirth and the releasing of the water and coming out of the water is very connected to our origin story, which is coming from water. So even something very simple, maybe something we take for granted, like drinking a glass of water or walking along a river, for us it's very deep, and it has a deep sort of cosmological explanation. So that's a little bit of our origins, and a little bit of the way we see ourselves on the day-to-day is where we are water in every way. Water is life. For those of you who've heard that refrain, it resonates very deeply for us as Piscataway people, because the water, the rivers, the creeks, these waterways, which are alive, have everything to do with our identities and ourselves at the deepest level. Now, my experience is different than the experiences of the people who you're going to talk to over the coming months. Our tribe is a very small tribe. We're in the Eastern Seaboard, which is unusual. You know, most Native people, most large reservations and large populations of Native people are out west. And we're also not a federally recognized tribe. We're a state recognized tribe. So our relationships are with, our treaties were all made with the colony of Maryland when it was a independent entity under the British Crown. We never had any agreements with the United States government. So for that reason, all our treaties and lands and our legality is tied to the state of Maryland as opposed to the federal government. And I think there will be somebody on here who will explain a little bit more about the unique relationship that it's called this, believe it or not, the trust, the federal trust that that federally recognized tribes have with the United States government. But that's not an experience I have. So I can answer questions about it, and I'm knowledgeable about it, and I studied American Indian law and policy, but that's not something that I live day to day. I didn't grow up on a reservation. I didn't, my tribe doesn't operate a casino. We don't eat fry bread and canned cheese, which, you know, unfortunately a lot of people on reservations rely on rations given by the federal government. So I have a very different experience, but I have, instead of viewing myself as less Native, which I think a lot of people might be concerned about, I just acknowledge the uniqueness of my position as the member of a small tribe in the East Coast. And one of the things that makes this experience unique is that we are in a major metropolitan area. You know, I grew up in Tacoma Park, you know, which is technically part of my ancestral homelands. But it was a lifestyle that was very urban, suburban. You know, I grew up 3 blocks over the DC line. I work in the city, and, you know, while I've lived out in Southern Maryland for extended periods of time, my home is really DC in a very serious way. And when you live in a major metropolitan area, you're kind of, it can be easy to get disconnected from these elemental things that define Native identity, this natural world that defines our world, that defines our universe and our understanding of it. But what it forces you to do is dig just a little bit beneath the surface of asphalt, concrete, and recognize the sacred that's all around us. Because even though Washington, D.C. is the capital city of a giant imperial nation, it's still sitting on land. It's still sitting alongside water. It's still lush green. When you look at Washington, D.C. from above, from a satellite, it's green, you know? And so, you know, life and nature permeates through every single aspect of our lives here. And I'll just give an example. And you know, like I said, I'll be doing some storytelling throughout this conversation. 1 second, sorry, I gotta get the door. My bad. Keep them busy, Annie. I'll be right back.
Sebby's funny. Yeah, so make sure you put questions in the chat box if you have any questions for Sebi. He can answer them kind of as he goes along or toward the end. Also, keep your videos off, please. I see maybe some people have it on, but it should be okay, but it would be, I think, generally better. We'll turn them on later. I think that's all I got. And yeah, here he is.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so this is a story I wanted to tell you, and it's actually something I learned from an elder from a different tribe who was visiting Washington, D.C. for the People's Climate March in 2017, which I was an organizer for. The elder's name is Sharon Day, and you can look up her work online. If you Google Nibi Walk, her name is Sharon Day. And she's an elder that's part of a nation called the Anishinaabe, which is from the Great Lakes region. And she does a ceremony called, or in English, it's called a water walk. And what she does is she gathers hi Julia. She gathers women from her tribe and from all different tribes and all different backgrounds. And what they'll do is they'll go to the source of a river, a water source, like a spring or a reservoir, and they'll gather that water in a copper pot. And it's clean water at its cleanest, purest form directly from the aquifer. And they'll walk on foot, and she's an elder, she's an older woman, and she will walk from the source of that river all the way along the river, all the way to where it empties into the ocean. And it's this epic journey, which they call a water walk, and they sing certain songs along it, and it's a big process of healing and teaching and learning between elders and younger people. She's also two-spirit, which we would call LGBTQ. She does a lot of healing with Native youth who are having struggles with their gender identities or sexual orientation. So it's this powerful healing process. But where they end up at the end of the river is usually in a major metropolitan area, say like the Mississippi River Delta, or the Potomac River, where it empties into the Chesapeake Bay. Usually these are the places where the river has picked up all the pollution of all the, human settlements along the way, including major cities. And they'll stop at the end of the river, and they'll take that vessel of pure water and empty the pure water from the source into this part of the river where it's most polluted. It's interacted the most with humans. It's gone through what she calls trauma, just like we as people have trauma. Water has trauma as well, from what it's gone through. And the purpose of that is to sort of close a circuit. It like closes a loop with that waterway. And it's meant to remind the river where it comes from and what it is. And in the process, of course, you realize that it's reminding us as Native people, and particularly Native women who she does it with, who they are, along the way, that we started from this birth, right, which is like this moment of purity and childhood where we're innocent and young, and then we go through things in our lives, especially Native people, we go through a lot of trauma in our lives. But there's moments where we have healing and restoration, and that's sort of the culminating. So there's a little background on Sharon Day. She's a powerful woman. And she was here, and she needed a ride to the protest, and so I offered to pick her up. She is going to open the protest with a water ceremony. And so she tells me, Sebi, I need to go to your river. What is your river, that you identify with? So I take her to the Potomac River because that's the river that, my people lived along for time immemorial. And we go to this place called Gravelly Point. For those of you from the area, it's this giant park right by Reagan National Airport. It's pretty much a big parking lot with some grass, and there's airplanes flying, 2 feet over your head. It's like very like industrial feeling park in DC. And it happens to be the closest thing to the airport where I picked her up from. And she gets out of the car and empties out her bottle of Dasani water and goes down to the river, goes down to the water. And, even having lived here my whole life, I've gone to Gravelly Point countless times for soccer games or to fly a kite or whatever, but I had never really paid attention to the water. As we go to the water, she's elderly, so she sends me with the bottle to go gather some. And as soon as I dip my hand into the water, I see 4 fish that circle around my hand. And they're big, they're not small fish. And, for me, it's being from the city and being in this very unnatural place. I was surprised, to see such big fish so close to me and circling in this way. And I pick up the water bottle and I turn back and I look at her and I ask her, did you do this? Like, was this the ceremony? Did you, like, essentially being like, did you use your magic powers to call the fish? And she goes, no, the fish always do that. The ceremony was you noticing. And it's part of recognizing the sacred around us, that even in these places that we view as unnatural or detached or artificial, the water is still alive, the people are still alive, the grass is growing, the wind is blowing, and the trees are growing. And I think growing up native in an urban setting teaches you how to recognize the sacred and the natural things around you. And so that's why sometimes, we do ceremony, even in DC, we'll do a ceremony, even in an urban place, we'll do a ceremony, because it's like recognizing that there's still life here. There's the soil and the earth has been here before this city, and also acknowledging the fact that there might be people buried all over DC. And that's not a scary thing. That's a good thing. That's an okay thing. That means land has memory and land has ancestors. And, those ancestors are my ancestors. So that's why we view, sacredness all around us. Okay, speaking of bones in the ground, I'm just going to show a short clip from a film to just offer some visual context to the things I'm talking about. This film is called The Flickering Flame. It was shot and directed by Seneca Mann, who's a close family friend. So he's an Indigenous filmmaker. And it's a film about my great-grandfather, who was a pretty well-known chief. His name was Turkey Tayac. And while the film focuses, the subject of the film is one man, which, that was in the 90s. And that idea of making like a film about a chief or a man just didn't age well. I'm like, why didn't you, go into like the community as a whole, or talk about the women that were behind him? And why didn't we talk about the problematic things about him? That concept doesn't age well, but it's a really important film because it has all this archival footage of native elders, of Piscataway elders who have since passed away, and it's archival footage of our burial grounds and our homelands. And it's like watching that movie, and it's like super retro, like it's ripped off of a VHS. Like you'll see it, but it is an important film for me now because it preserves that moment in time. I think it was the early 90s. So the person who's on screen right now that you'll see speaking is my mom, when she was young, which is also like hilarious for me. But I'm just going to show you a clip from the film that talks a little bit about our burial grounds, which are located in southern Prince George's County, in a national park called Piscataway Park, which anyone can visit, by the way, and invite you all to go visit and pay respects if you ever feel called to. So this is just a little piece of history of my people. So let me do a little screen share here. Okay. And can everybody see this film? Yes? Okay. I got the Mexican little finger wiggle from Adriana, so that's how I know it's real. I see you. Okay.
Our burial grounds, the Piscataway burial grounds, which we call Mahon, hundreds and thousands of our people are buried there. And it's also the site of our ancient village, where our people had been free at one point. So that's a very important place to us, not just for the sacredness of it, but also a remembrance of knowing that at one point our people were free at this spot, and again they can be free there someday. Because for us, the dead, when they're buried, go on a spirit journey that lasts for a very long time as the bones are in contact with Mother Earth. And also the ancestors that are there intercede for us on our behalf to the Creator. So when archaeologists started to excavate that area, and it was done under the direction of a woman who had bought property there, named Alice Ferguson, that really, it really hurt that spot. It really hurt the dead, it hurt the living, and it hurt the land. Turkey actually had seen this happen, and my dad saw it, my uncles saw it. They saw hundreds of people just being pulled, yanked, ripped from the earth, and not just being ripped from the earth, but also they believe being ripped from the world of the spirit, from the journey that they had been given the instructions to be on. Many of the remains were taken to the Smithsonian, and some of them were taken to the University of Michigan, and some of them are now also in the possession of the Maryland Historical Trust, which we're trying to get those remains back from all of those places, because it's a very central spot to our religious belief.
Okay. Did you see that? Did the audio come through okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. Great. So it's a clip from a film, potentially a little bit out of context, but hopefully you were able to understand some of what my mom was saying in that clip when she was explaining a bit of the history of our burial grounds, which to us is our most holy land, which is in southern Maryland, just about an hour south of DC. So again, this is all super present and very like immediate and real, especially for those of you who are DC and Maryland residents. This is something that's right underneath your feet. What you probably saw in that clip is our approach to death and understanding of what it means to walk that road, and what life after not life after death, what life looks like. A good analogy for people who have a hard time getting their head around the way we view death is, if anyone saw Coco, Disney film, it's like that. All across the Americas, our understanding of death is similar, and we have a ceremony every November, right around the same time as Dia de los Muertos, that is called the Feast of the Dead. And it's the same thing. It's where you commune with the dead, you spend time with them, and you acknowledge their presence in your daily life, that they're like your representatives in the spirit world, that they are capable of intervening in the living world, and maybe not in ways that we fully understand, but they're present. And so when you walk on the land, in Mahon, in our burial grounds, you feel an interesting effect on your feet, where it's not just that you put your step down and the land kind of buckles under your foot. It's almost like the earth presses back up against your feet. It's an interesting experience, and you can really only experience it when you go there. But there's thousands of people buried there, and it's definitely something that you feel. I'm going to bring in another idea. which is technology. This is kind of going back to Indigenous People 101, because I think I take a lot of things for granted having grown up this way that maybe other people don't understand. I think the dominant narrative is that, even in the liberal and progressive world, is that the Europeans came, and since we weren't immune to the diseases, we were technologically inferior. The bad Europeans, or the good Europeans, whichever way you look at it, decimated our population. And that's not really true. When it comes to technology, you just have to expand your idea of what technology is, because social organization is a technology. Agriculture is a technology, like corn, potatoes, tomato. These are agricultural products that were created by human beings through science. Health and medicine, the way people lived, the way people ate, it's not just because they didn't have access to fat and alcohols. They chose not to, consume fat, sugar, and alcohol when they could have consumed it. So there's medicine and health technologies, herbal, healing. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about social organization, because the way we organize our societies involves the dead. Like I said, they're present, they're here with us every single day. The way we organized our villages was in longhouses, which were large, multi-family homes made out of bark and wood that were permanent structures. We were a sedentary agricultural people, unlike in the plains where people were more nomadic. We were a sedentary agricultural people. Permanent multi-family homes that were presided over by a clan mother, which was the matriarch of the family. So each clan, for example, I'm the Beaver Clan, so we have a house, and that's the Beaver house, right? And the person who presided over that is everyone's mom or grandma. When a man would come of age, or when a man would get married, he would move to his wife's house. So the daily life and the living situation and the closest thing we could call property ownership was actually held by women. And as we can probably see through the imbalances in modern day American society, it's probably a more advanced and enlightened way of organizing society. When a woman and a man were no longer happy in a relationship, the protocol for divorce would be the woman takes her man's shit and puts it outside the door. So very progressive in that sense. But an interesting thing about these houses and how they were organized, other than being presided over by matriarchs, is that when a member of that family died, they would be buried at the front door. And the entryway of each house was also the family's burial pit, and the reason that was done, or what I have been told, is that when you enter that house, you not only are interacting with the living members of that family, but you're also interacting with the dead members of that family, that you have to step over and sort of essentially get vetted by the dead before you can even interact with the living. So, life and death, as we know, are a cycle and are necessary. Each one is necessary for the other. We're deeply intertwined in our society. And that's something that I find really helpful in my daily life and what you could call my practice, because it not only makes us more accepting and comfortable when our loved ones pass away, but it also helps you understand life in a deeper way, as something that's not just what happens, from the time you're born until the time you die. That existence is something much greater than that. It's essentially removing the ego a little bit from your experience of life. I'm gonna now shift a little bit and talk about, now that you have a little bit of an understanding of Piscataway history and Piscataway life, I want to talk a little bit about this term American Indian and Indigenous and what it means in the bigger context, like how we fit into it. Because since the beginning of time, we've called ourselves Piscataway. But only relatively recently have we identified as American Indian or Indigenous. Of course, some of you might be familiar with the history of the word Indian. It's just Columbus was geographically confused and called everybody that he met on a giant, diverse continent an Indian. But that term has been reappropriated by Indigenous people to name a shared experience of connection to land and the accompanying colonization and displacement. So I'm just going to show another clip from the film that talks a little bit about our embracing of the term American Indian and our participation in what was called the American Indian movement, which was a human rights movement, and some people would call an anti-colonial struggle that took place in the 1970s here in this country. So just to give you a little bit of context, the speaker is my Uncle Billy, who is our current chief. He's the 28th generation chief of our tribe. So that means he is the 28th named person who's designated as a hereditary chief. Those 28 generations are held by an oral history that go back to about 1000 AD. And so he's going to explain a little bit about his entrance into the movement. And I have a good question, and I'm seeing some great questions, but I'll answer this one because it's an important one. The head chief of the Piscataway was called the Tayac. So Tayac was the title, it wasn't chief. Tayac is something that is probably better explained as emperor. And if we were to look at it from the American system of governance, the women served as like a representative legislative body, where they had their families that were organized into these clans, and they spoke for their families. And then the men were sort of executives, where you had war chiefs and peace chiefs. And a war chief wasn't someone who's at war all the time. That's a bad translation. Really, it's someone who's in charge of foreign affairs, or someone who's in charge of diplomacy or external facing things. And then peace chiefs were more like had more administrative roles. And then on top of all that is the Tayac. However, since we are a matrilineal society, the title was not passed from father to son. It was the chief's sister's son, so the chief's nephew, that would become the successive chief. So it still had to go through a woman's line. And now that we're in this time and place, and our needs are different and our society is organized differently, we can reinvent and reimagine how we choose to designate leadership. Seems like there's a need, at least in my community, and I think in a lot of communities, to reinforce the power and authority of our clan mothers. So I think everything changes, and I'm the nephew of the current chief, but I'm not in line to succeed. So that's not a responsibility that I'll be burdened with. I think it's a very specific job, and not for me. It's my cousin will be the chief. So I'm just going to show this clip here, which is my uncle speaking, who's the current chief, and he's talking about the American Indian movement, and he's going to be referencing a demonstration at the Bureau of he's going to call it the BIA, and what he's referencing is an armed occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the government agency that's under the Department of Interior that governs or rules over Native American tribes. It used to be in the Department of War, but it was moved to the interior in the 20th century. So it's an institution that is not particularly friendly, but serves like an essential administrative role. So people occupied it to demand greater rights for our nations. So I'm just gonna pull this up here. Can everybody see the screen? Okay, I got the finger wiggle. Good.
We believe basically that no one owns the earth. No one person owns the earth. It's just held in trust by one generation for the oncoming generation. Our footprints are on this land. My dad's footprints, my grandfather's footprints. Each generation is in stewardship of the land, and that it means a great thing to preserve the land, because without land, you're not a people. You're just a part of society. In the early 70s, I met some Indians from out west. They came to Washington, D.C. to open an office for the American Indian movement. I was really shocked because here were some Indians who, man, wearing their hair long, wearing chokers, Indian-style clothing, telling it just the way it was, that basically that we were a group of people, Indian people were victims of genocide by the United States government. Then after I met these guys, I went over to my dad's house and that I wanted my dad to check him out. He told me to bring him on over there and that he would talk to him. And he said that, Billy said, I never thought I'd ever see it again in my lifetime. He said that these people are preaching Indianism, to be Indian, pride in being Indian. He said, you know what? He said, I pushed those young boys and did every trick I knew to get them excited, to make sure they weren't lying and everything. He said, they were straight. And he said, I was real proud of what they said and everything. And he said that I think they're for real. They're for real. There was the Trail of Broken Trees. That was an occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that Turkey got in touch with me and said, I hear the Indians took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he says, is that true? I said, yeah, that's true. He says, were those young boys involved in it? I said, yeah, they were involved in it. He said, I want you to come over here and get me. I said, well, what do you want to do? He said, I'm going down there with them. He said, because what they're doing is right. And he says, it's our duty and it's our obligation to go there and be with them, me and you. And he said, I don't know what the hell is going to happen here, Billy. But he said, whatever happens to the people here is going to happen to us because we're with them 100%. And he went every single day to the Bureau of Indian Affairs until the end of the occupation. Then later on, these other walks started coming back in. A lot of these walks were to protest the treatment of Indians. One was the longest walk that came all the way from Alcatraz, launched by Chief Bill Eaglefeather. So these walks would come in. Turkey told me, he said, you be sure to tell me about what's going on and that you come over here and get me, Billy. He didn't believe in telephones. He said telephones disturbed your sleep. They were too modern. He says, if you want me, you come over here and you leave a note on my door for me and I'll get in contact with you and we make arrangements to meet. He told me, he said that he said he just had to be here for the Indian people. He said it was a critical time for the Indian people and he was there. He always walked up front with the elders. One of the things he would do, he would always carry, when he went on official meetings, he would carry his bonnet. that he had. He had me like in a paper bag, brown paper bag. He loved the brown paper bags. And that before he'd go into the meeting, like with Senator Fulbright or some official, he would wait a minute, and he would take the bonnet out and put the bonnet on his head, and that represented authority of who he was. He was a chief. He'd go in and say, "We're going in here officially. That's why you got to go in here properly." He said, "You got to represent yourself properly." And he said, "That's why I'm doing this here."
Okay, so that's a little clip that that talks a little bit about how we came into this bigger movement of Indigenous people, and how we came to understand ourselves beyond just being a little group of people in Southern Maryland that were dealing with, you know, the KKK and the police and the Park Service and, you know, the FBI and like all these institutions that were trying to destroy us. We came to understand ourselves as part of a bigger group of people and part of a bigger movement. And, you know, American Indians and most people will agree, we didn't have a MLK moment. We didn't have a March on Washington. We didn't have a civil rights movement. We went straight to Black Panthers. And there's a reason for that. It stems mostly from the fact that we identify as sovereign nations. We identify as people who are separate from the United States government. We precede the United States government. We have distinct cultures and land bases that are different from the United States. And like my uncle said, he said, without land, you're not a people. You're just a part of society. And in the case of American Indians, you're a marginalized part of society. But when we have land, we have nations. So a lot of our rhetoric and a lot of our way of understanding ourselves as Native people actually has a lot more to do with, has a lot more in common with Black nationalists or the Chicano movement or anti-colonial struggle in Haiti or in Africa or in Southeast Asia. We identify more with those people than we do with the mainstream civil rights movement. So, you know, throughout the 70s, coming to understand ourselves as American Indian people, coming to understand our tribe as an Indian nation, a sovereign nation, and then coming to recognize other people who had similar situations, not just in the US, but in Canada, Mexico. My mom was part of a delegation of Native people that went down to El Salvador to spend time with the indigenous people of El Salvador, many of whom actually live in the DC area currently, and down to Colombia and Brazil. I mean, there is solidarity. There is a network of indigenous nations across the entire hemisphere that hold each other in solidarity. So going from Indian nationalism to, and this started more in the 80s, Indian internationalism. So viewing ourselves as a league of indigenous sovereign nations, rather than a persecuted minority in colonial countries. So, which brings me to another sort of personal story, which is in I think it was 88 during the Salvadoran Civil War. And for those of you who live in the DC area, you know how important the Salvadoran community is to the culture of the DMV. During the Salvadoran Civil War, you had the left, which was the sort of Marxist faction. You had the right, which was the US CIA supported. It's a common story across Central America and across all of Latin America. And for those of you who were part of the oh, hi, Frida. Cool. Okay, so maybe you can have something to say after I wrap this story up. But it was a very complicated situation in El Salvador, and you had two sides that were both inflicting and experiencing extreme violence. But the people who received the brunt of the violence were the indigenous people, which make up a very tiny fraction of Salvadorian society. if you ask a lot of El Salvadorians living in the U.S. today, they'll tell you we don't have Indians in El Salvador, but they exist and they live in remote areas and near a place called Sonsonate. And at the height of the Civil War in the 80s, the chief of this federation of indigenous nations called Anis had his life threatened because of his identity and because of his race and language. He spoke Nahuatl, which is a language that's spoken down there. And his family was targeted. His right-wing paramilitary attacked his house and did some really unspeakable things to his family, and they had to flee the country. And they fled on foot and walked across the border and, really like unspeakable stuff. I won't even go into details, but when they arrived to this area, which is where they had relationships, which is how most migrants get certain places, where they go somewhere where they have a relationship. Before going to the consulate of El Salvador, before going to the Latino institutions like Casa de Maryland that does support work for people, before doing all that, the first thing he did was he went to my uncle's farm in Maryland and said, can I live here? Do I have your permission to live here? And, despite, being illegal or undocumented by, the American government standards, to him, what mattered more was having the permission of the indigenous people to live in Maryland. And, from that moment, the relationship was started. And he would always bring his community members to our ceremonies. So anytime we had a ceremony at my place, we would have this group of Native people from El Salvador who were living in the US. So, since my mom is Native, my dad is Colombian, I was always the translator. So whenever, my uncle was giving a sermon or explaining something about a ceremony, I would be the one translating. We also, at all of our ceremonies, have a community of people from Guatemala representing the International Maya League. We have Comunidad Sur Andes from Bolivia, and people from all different backgrounds that identify as indigenous come to our ceremonies. So in that sense, we're unusually inclusive, and that has a lot to do with our proximity to a major destination for Latino immigrants. So I'm gonna leave with just this one last clip, which sort of sums up some of the ideas we've been talking about. Screen share. Excuse me, just 1 minute. I'm just going to play this clip and then respond to a couple questions briefly, and then we'll open up the floor to other questions.
Protecting and making sacred the site of Mahon.
Turkey today is looking across the river at George Washington's home saying, yes, we're still here. And you're not going to destroy us. All the policies that you put into forth, becoming the first president of the United States, your successors have put in, but you're not going to destroy it. So he's there looking across the river, confronting George Washington every minute, every second of every day. And I believe it's a symbol of the Indian resistance in this country today. I'm here to tell the United States government, and all these other immigrant governments of North, Central, and South America, and I'm living proof of it, that their policies of genocide failed. And we're on our way back. And that.
So there you go. Happy ending. Um, and I had more to say, but we're running out of time, and I really want to get to a few of these questions. I would just say, to sum up in a few bullet points, the big picture things I want to leave everybody with are deep relationship and connection with water, which is at the core of our understanding of life in the universe. Finding the sacredness in unexpected places, and just realizing that the natural world is all around us. You don't have to take an expensive vacation to Costa Rica. You can go on the other side of the river, that and see the natural world around you. I would also want to reinforce that colonization is something that's ongoing. It's not something that happened in 1492 or in 1620 or in 1890. It's something that started in 1492 on this continent and is ongoing. Each generation of Native people experiences it, and each generation of settlers perpetuate it. And the ways that happens are very subtle and at times insidious, in ways we don't even notice on either side, but it happens. I would also one of the takeaways I would hope you get from this talk is a different way to approach death and renewal, a different way to understand the ancestors and the way they have a very present effect on our day-to-day lives, that they're still with us, and all our relationships are ultimately accountable to them because we come from them. And that, when I talk about improving the condition of Native people, and when we talk about like struggle for social justice for Native people, we're not using a civil rights lens. We're using a human rights lens, because civil rights lens depends very heavily on rights guaranteed by a government that we have no reason to trust in the first place. And it relies very heavily on a legal system that was built to take away our land and eliminate our culture. So that, human rights and the implications of respecting someone fully as a human, who they are, is actually a much higher standard than asking a government to follow its own laws. Because even if everything was perfect, it would still be bad for us. So that's why we advocate for human rights by any means necessary. Unfortunately, we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about this other point, which is how non-Native people can engage respectively with Native communities and cultures, the difference between cultural sharing and cultural appropriation, and what it looks like when Native people take agency over relationships with non-Native people. If there are questions about that, I can go a bit into that. But if not, then maybe we'll leave it for another time. So I'm just gonna turn the floor over to Frida, who has something to say, who's leading our next call. I'm really glad, Frida, that you're here and that you have something to say. It's an interesting history that we overlap with. So I'll turn it over to Frida now. Is Frida there?
So you know what? Hi, everybody. Frida was taking care of her kids right now, so maybe she's dealing with some of that right now. So maybe you can continue what you were telling us about, because someone, Jenque, wants to follow up on what you were telling about how can we involve as a non-Indigenous, or the people who's not Indigenous, and I think that's important for you to share with everybody.
Right. Okay. So I would say, the first step is to just, if anybody has seen Star Wars, to unlearn what you have learned, in the words of Master Yoda, just everything you know or think you know about Native people, unless you are in close direct relationship with people who are a part of a contemporary existing Native American community, just let all that shit go, because there's a lot of mythology and a lot of mysticism that's been built around our people. The first one is the one that's in your attic right now, which is the I'm part Native American. Yes, you are. You might be. You know, whether you are or you aren't is not really relevant. And you know, Elizabeth Warren has said it, and you've heard a bunch of people say it. Maybe your grandma said it, you know, and maybe you have a picture, and maybe it's there. But the first thing you need to acknowledge is, unless you grew up as part of an Indigenous community, or as part, if you lived your life as an Indigenous person, that's not an identity that's yours to claim. So just give yourself some space to get over that, and take some humility when going forward with that, because what that does is it reinforces a harmful mythology, which is that, oh, we're all Native American, right? That, oh, you know, that's, you know, an identity that I have, so that connects me to the land. And really what that does is it deflects a lot of responsibility that you have. Because if you can say you're a Native American, then you don't have to hold yourself accountable to Native people, and you don't have to acknowledge that you're on land that, you know, was taken unfairly. So there's a lot of history behind that, of when people dress up like Native Americans, when they wear feather headdresses or paint their face, or they say, I'm part Native American, or I was Native American in a past life. These are things that people feel very emotionally and very deeply in themselves. But do that work, take that work onto yourself to let that go, because it's part of a bigger pattern of justifying or rationalizing your presence on land that was unjustly taken. So, and it looks like Frida's back. Okay, so we'll jump back into that topic, but I want to make sure Frida has a chance to speak. So go ahead, Frida.
It looks like she lost again communication, so she was having problem with the connection. So continue, Sebi. Sorry.
Okay, I'll keep going. Another thing that, so the first thing is checking yourself. You know, appropriating Native American dress, spirituality, customs, culture is something that is something that you can address, and there's the best thing I can tell you to do is to stop. You know, it's until you are in direct relationship with a Native person who's specifically inviting you to their community and their way of doing things, to not do it. A lot of people, especially in the wellness world, claim that they've been given permission from a Native elder to do certain ceremonies, or to share certain ceremonies and do certain things. And to that I say, I obviously you have no way of proving or disproving whether a medicine man in the Amazon gave, you know, like this white man the permission to conduct ceremonies, but to just hold a little humility in yourself and recognize that unless you're in direct relationship with that person, that source culture, with who's at the source of the culture, to just, you know, step back and not engage. And even this translates into smaller things like burning sage and using, now Palo Santo is very popular right now. And, you know, for me, I grew up smelling those things and very deeply emotionally connected to them. And it's part of my spiritual life that I feel very deeply. And I probably understand deeper than people who just picked it up since it became popular. But that being said, you know, that if that's something that helps you or resonates with you, there is an appropriate way to go about it. the important thing is to make sure that you're sourcing your sage, Palo Santo, and any other indigenous incense or medicine that you use, making sure you're sourcing it from a native person and making sure you're sourcing it from a sustainable source. Because what's happening is this new age market can be very extractive and predatory, where we're seeing fields of sage that were once thriving and used by the indigenous people of that area are now getting clear cut, like totally decimated, harvested unsustainably because of this huge market that now exists among non-native people. So same goes for peyote, San Pedro cactus. These like very important medicines are getting over harvested by non-native people and sold, to make people privately wealthy. So, just make sure you know where your stuff is coming from and how it was harvested, because native folks know how to harvest in a way that is regenerative. So you just take a part of the plant, right? And there's a way to do it. It's just not being done sustainably right now. So that's something you can do. Let's see if Frida can get on. She said she's back.
She's having problems, Annie and Sebi, with she's trying to speak, but we can't hear her. So I don't know if you can do something, Annie, from your side.
Unfortunately, she is unmuted, so it's the problem. Maybe she muted her own phone or something, maybe. So,
okay.
Oh, she says she's talking. Frida, if you could unmute, maybe there's a button on your phone that you've muted it with, because I see you're on the phone. No, you haven't muted your phone. Well, we can't hear anything, unfortunately, and you're not muted. No. So maybe we'll try.
I don't know. Maybe she wants, if you want to maybe write something there, we can read it, or... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great idea. You could write something there. And Frida, just for everyone's information, will be leading our next call. So would be nice to hear her for a couple seconds or a couple minutes, but maybe you want to drop off and dial back in again. That's another option. And maybe in the meantime, Sebi could answer this question that came up about Nathan Phillips. That would be a very interesting thing to hear your thoughts on. Oh wait, she wrote that she acknowledges, everyone can see this. She acknowledged the Piscataway land where we're standing on the DMV. Yes, that's right. I think a lot of us are on Piscataway land right now. So, and yeah.
There was a question here about Nathan Phillips. So I working very closely with Nathan Phillips. I actually live with him. This is his house, or it's my house that he moved into since the incident. Things have been a little crazy for him, but we're doing some support on the PR side and on the legal side. There's a huge resurgence in conversation about Native rights since this incident that was captured on video and went viral in January during the Indigenous Peoples March. There's a video that a lot of people have seen. It was on the news and stuff, of an elderly Native American man, who's my friend Nathan Phillips, being surrounded and taunted by a group of white teenagers wearing "Make America Great Again" hats, who were there for the anti-abortion March for Life rally. And it was an interesting story. It's too complicated to fully get into right now. But one thing that's important to first start with is that Nathan Phillips is a lifelong activist. He's not someone who just went viral overnight. He's someone who, I think my family, he came down to our land in the early 80s. So he's known my family since then. So he's a longtime movement activist. And he's also like an old school hippie, like in a very like authentic way, like, went to the rainbow gatherings and, that kind of thing. He's just like also like an old school hippie, and did a lot of work against nuclear extraction and, really interesting storied life. What happened was there was a confrontation between these Hebrew Israelites, which is sort of a strange religious faction, people who identify as Israelites, but they're mostly Black folks in urban centers who have a lot of strange beliefs about gay people and women, and all kinds of messed up shit. And then, of course, this like group of like Trump kids who were there for protesting abortion, well, all boys, of course. And they were in this belligerent confrontation and on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And Nathan Phillips was there, and he stepped in between the two groups, and he was singing a song that you actually heard in one of the clips I played, which is the Anthem of the American Indian Movement. And an interesting thing about that song is it's a song that was written in honor of a Native American man who was murdered in a hate crime in Nebraska. And he's from Nebraska. So to him, it has a very personal meaning. But what he was doing was he was invoking, by singing that song, he was invoking the movement as a whole. And it's a song of unity and a song of sort of togetherness. So from the Indigenous perspective, he sees two groups that are, you know, divided and fighting, and he steps inside and got himself involved that way. And then, of course, you know, after the viral outrage, there was a huge blowback when the Trump kids hired a multi-million-dollar PR firm to slander him in the media and flip the narrative. And ultimately, what you see, one of the big takeaways out of it is the outsized power that white people have over the press, even when they're acting so obviously bad. And then, you know, when you have a grassroots or native person up against this sort of professionalized media atmosphere, you know, they can be totally victimized by that. But, you know, we've been working closely with him. We've done a couple of videos with him, helping him, you know, get things together. I think I'm someone who bridges the, you know, the old school movement generation with the new school, you know, media and stuff like that. So we were able to help him with that. Another question I saw was
Sebi, sorry to interrupt, but maybe we have just 2 minutes to wrap up. So I don't know if you want to maybe answer that question later or written form, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Whatever you want to do.
Annie?
Yeah, it's probably, Sebi, you've given us so much to think about. I took some notes for us to talk about, just as a reminder for everybody. We have 3 calls like this where we'll have someone leading and guiding. And then on the 4th call, we'll have a chance to have a sharing about what we've heard. And I'll bring in the notes that we have, and then people can share how this landed for them. I know it's kind of a long way away, but we found that it's an hour and a half is really not long enough to have a deep Dharma sharing with a lot of people, so that we will save that for the 4th call. And we will definitely have written resources and links that'll be on our website. Somebody asked for that. And why don't we finish with a single bell right now, and then we'll have a few more announcements about upcoming things. So if you want to put your video on so we can see each other during the final bell, the closing bell, that would be great. Adriana, did you want to say something for the bell?
No, I'm okay. I can say something after. Thank you, Annie.
Okay. We'll just enjoy 3 sounds of the bell together, just to absorb so much of that wisdom that we've just been given. It was so amazing and all encompassing. Maybe coming back to your breathing in, I feel I'm breathing in, and breathing out, I feel I'm breathing out.